Hi, Tripp Harrison here, Twiford Funeral Homes, Manteo, North Carolina, on the beautiful Outer Banks, and we're continuing our series, What to Do When Someone Dies, where we cover, as a funeral home, and I, as a funeral director, cover issues that are logistical in nature relating to the death of a loved one. Obviously, it's an unpleasant time for everyone, and it's also a time when a lot of decisions have to be made. So in this video series, we cover a number of those issues so that the viewer can kind of get an idea of what they'll be facing when they deal directly with the funeral home. Today we're going to talk a little bit about a subject that is probably the oldest subject we have in our book here, and that's embalming. The embalming process is basically where a funeral director or an embalmer specifically will take the deceased remains of a human being and replace the blood that's in their system and the other bodily fluids with a preservative liquid that will slow the decomposition process. The purpose of that is primarily to extend the time between when the individual passes away and the time that their final disposition happens, whether they're cremated or buried in the ground or what have you. It gives more time in there for there to be arrangements like funerals and viewings and visitations and things like that. So that's the idea. But embalming is actually an old science. It goes back 5,000 years. Many of you probably know this already. The Egyptians were the inventors, so to speak, of embalming. They used processes that were quite advanced for 5,000 years ago, and they did preserve human remains for quite some time. In fact, they still find somewhat intact corpses from that era inside of pyramids as they just continued to explore that area in the Middle East. But the process back then, of course, was done with vinegar and spices and who knows what to not only preserve the loved one, but to prepare them for their adventure in the next life. But here it's really a matter of getting some time with the loved one still physically present in their body, at least. While they're not there spiritually, their body is there and gives some time for some things to happen. So why is embalming done? Well, not only for that reason, but there's another important thing to consider, and that is there is a safety a gain that you make when a body is embalmed. The embalming process, by removing most of the bodily fluids and replacing them with very strong chemicals, it does sort of lower the risk of the transmission of disease or infection from that body. So that's not a big concern in most cases, but it's an important thing to consider as another reason for embalming. So a lot of people have questions about it, and I've taken some of the more common questions I get and encounter in my day-to-day life when people find out I'm a funeral director. They say, hey, what about this and what about that? So let me just address a few of these that are embalming related. People will say, Tripp, does embalming keep the body from decomposing? Or how long does it keep the body from decomposing? Well, the embalming process doesn't keep the body from decomposing. That decomposition will happen because we're organic beings, and eventually that process will occur. So it doesn't eliminate the decomposition, but it does slow it significantly in the beginning. That's why we have that extra time for embalming. The embalming buys us some time to make arrangements to include perhaps people from out of town, to give them time to travel in, to be a part of that service with the body present. There are a number of reasons that might be a pragmatic decision, but it does delay that process. People say, well, how long does that delay? Well, it depends, and it's really not necessarily tied to any one thing. A lot of it has to do with the environment under which the person died, whether they were ill or not, their size, in some cases the environmental conditions that they were in, how long they had been passed away before the embalming happens. Those are all variables that can be taken into consideration. In some cases, an embalmer can preserve a body, and that body can stay in its similar condition for 10 or 15 years or longer. And in some cases, the embalming process might buy a couple of days for the body to still look okay, to have people come in and see and pay their respects. But it does provide a little more time, regardless, for loved ones to make that one last physical connection, that visual connection with them. Two words that are interchanged a lot, and I want to talk about them, and those are the words viewing and visitation. Now, when I say they're interchanged a lot, I mean some people say viewing and some people say visitation. I personally think of them as two different things. When you have a viewing of a deceased person, typically, in my mind, that means that it's a very brief, almost, in fact, in our industry, we refer to it sometimes as an ID view, although the loved one's probably already been identified if the family's there. It sometimes is just a very brief connection because those who are closest to that person need to see them not alive to sort of have closure in dealing with the fact that they're passed away. It's very brief, and it's not done in any elaborate way. Some funeral homes require that it be done through a window for safety reasons because the body's not embalmed. There hasn't been that chemical introduction that increases the safety barrier a little bit. So depending on the situation, you may encounter that. And some funeral homes don't allow it at all. I've worked in some funeral homes where they just don't have a live person-to-person viewing without the body being embalmed first. A visitation, on the other hand, is more of a public display of the remains of the loved one, so that family and friends and extended family and acquaintances, even in some cases, or co-workers, they can all come by and take one last look at their loved one's physical remains. And for a lot of people, that's a real benefit. It gives them closure because they've seen them passed away. And no one ever looks the same or as good lying in a casket as they do in real life. It does provide, in most cases, it provides some closure for the individual and gives you sort of one last look at that life lived and that person that they cared for. So that's what, in my mind, that's what a visitation is. And a visitation, by law in most states, requires that the body be embalmed because it does offer that safety factor of protecting now a larger number of people who will be coming into at least the same room. In some cases, people touch, and that's all an opportunity for there to be some safety issues if the body is not embalmed. So that's, in my mind, that's the difference between a viewing and a visitation. Another question people ask is, does a loved one have to be embalmed in order for them to be viewed? I think we just covered that's not required for an ID view. I really recommend it just for safety's sake. And we also, when in the embalming process, the embalmer has the opportunity to sort of tidy up the individual. Depending on the cause of death, sometimes that might take a little makeup or a little repositioning of them so that if there was any trauma related to their death, it gives them a chance to do something with that to make that last visual memory positive. People ask all the time if direct cremation, if someone has arrangements already made or the family decides upon direct cremation at the time of death, the body does not have to be embalmed in order to be taken to the crematory. We'll cover this in more detail when we talk about the process of selecting direct cremation. But the fact is, as long as the body's not going to be viewed and it's not going to be held for an extended period of time, embalming is not required. Some people do it anyway, but it is not required and the person can be directly cremated. So how much does it cost to embalm a human body? Well, that will vary from funeral home to funeral home, from area of the country to area of the country, state to state, whether you're dealing with a corporation presenting themselves as a family funeral home or you're dealing with an actually family-owned funeral home. Those are all variables in the price that you'll be quoted for embalming. Funeral homes are required by law to provide a general price list upon request, which will list sort of a la carte the prices of the various services, including embalming. At the time of this video, which is 2022, embalming prices range around the country from the high 500s, $600 perhaps, up through, I've seen as high as pushing $1,000 for the process alone. So that's a factor to consider for some people, but over a period of years, the last visual memory that you have of that person being presentable, it might be worth that money over the long term. It just depends on the situation, and it's certainly an individual call. One question I have here is embalming a respectful procedure? Yes, it's not done. There's nothing that's done that's horrifying. It's simply a process to replace the fluids, so it's all done very carefully and under controlled circumstances. Who does embalming? Well, typically, in most states, the embalming license and the funeral director license are connected. So most funeral directors have also a license for embalming, but that's not always true. I've got several friends in this industry that are only embalmers. They work for funeral home chains where they work in a separate building and all they do is prepare bodies for viewing and for burial. And I've got other friends that work strictly with families, making arrangements and don't ever have any contact with the preparation of the human body. One last question is, can a body be embalmed if there is an autopsy performed? Yes, it's a more complicated procedure and it takes a little longer, but if for some reason the medical examiner in your area has ruled that the loved one that you lost has to be embalmed or has to be autopsied, that autopsied body is returned to the funeral home and they do a little different type of embalming, which we can talk about in a future video. So that's a little bit of behind the scenes with embalming and what goes on to help you make a better decision, whether it's now for someone that you're dealing with or whether it's for down the road for yourself in pre-planning. Whatever it might be, we offer the information for your use. Thanks for joining us. Please like and subscribe to this channel and you'll get continuing more information from us as we go along. From Manteo, North Carolina, I'm Tripp Harrison at Twiford Funeral Homes. Thanks for being with me.